set.
Thank you so much, Father Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I hope that you're all staying cool and have a refreshing drink handy. And in that prayer was a little notation, even though Father Tom didn't say it, that we all have the patience every so often to deal with those 14 and 16-year-olds when we've had just about enough of them. The good news is that they do have brains. And by the end of this webinar, you are going to understand that their brains are actually fairly impressive. They use them differently than we do, and you'll be able to walk away with a couple of strategies for creating some pretty effective connections with your students. So I'm going to get right into it and just start off with a couple of pictures and a little bit of lightness. So some of you might also be parents as well. Some of you may have come from elementary education, and I just want to set up this picture with what a conversation may have been like with a young girl and her mom, her primary caregiver, a classroom teacher, or something along those lines. And at that age, around 6 or 7, children typically look at adults as authority figures. They spend a lot of time trying to please them, so to speak. Something really interesting happens as they enter adolescence. That picture may turn into something like that. And one of the reasons why I love this picture is because it gives us some insight into the tactics that both teenagers and adults use in a scenario like this. For myself, having been in education since 1995, I think those early years, I did spend some time thinking that if a teenager wasn't listening to me, the first thing I needed to do was to raise my voice. And after a couple of experiences, I began to realize that that might not have been effective, but I was still having an emotional response. And to use neuroscience speak, in a lot of ways, I was coming from my limbic system. And today we're going to talk a little bit about two particular areas of the brain. Number one, the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. So when I felt like a teenager wasn't listening to me, a student wasn't listening to me as a classroom teacher, I may have raised my voice. The other thing that teenagers, particularly this girl in the picture, has an uncanny ability to do is to indirectly communicate to the adult that she is not important. And this can be a trigger for many of us. We'll spend the rest of the webinar talking about those types of triggers. So I just want to reflect on the first dean of students I had ever worked with at Cardinal Spellman High School in the Bronx. Guy's name was Freddie Opper. He was also a basketball coach. And he said to me one day, I was really frustrated. I felt like this particular period of students wasn't listening to me. And he said, you know what, Terry? When you really want kids to listen, what you need to do is lower your voice. I was like, how am I going to do that? What I've learned over the years is that sometimes being an adult is tapping into that part of our brain that runs contrary to how we want to respond emotionally, how we want to respond immediately. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. This next picture, I want to give you some insight into a little bit of my personal story. I'm also the parent of a 31-year-old. And Dylan, this is not a picture of him. Dylan spent a lot of time talking during the day, and the time when he was not talking was particularly early in the morning. So I'd go into his bedroom on Saturday morning, right before he would wake up, and I'd just look at him. He looked so peaceful. He'd open up his eyes and ask if we were going to have Fruit Loops and watch the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner hour. I may be dating myself a little bit with that. But something interesting happened as Dylan aged and I would go into his bedroom. In his teen years, this is typically what I would walk into. And this oftentimes was 5 minutes before the bus was going to pick them up. It could have been 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday. What we know from the research is that the adolescent brain will actually shift during puberty, and its sleep clock will be pushed back by approximately 2 to 3 hours. The way in which this works is progesterone levels and testosterone levels get to a certain point and they begin to actually marinate in the brain, if you will, and they make their way into this limbic system, this primitive emotional part of the brain. And in the limbic system is an organ that we'll talk a little bit more about. It's called the hypothalamus, grouping of cells in there called the suprachiasmatic nuclei, or the SCN. And this is our biological sleep clock. So this is what essentially releases melatonin at a certain point. In the evening, it lets us know when we're tired. And when they were 7, 8, 9 years old, they may have been releasing melatonin at 8 or 9 o'clock and falling asleep relatively quickly. During puberty, that clock gets pushed back in terms of its releasing of melatonin. And teenagers aren't, getting tired until 11, 12, 12:30, 1 a.m. in the morning. And you throw this gadget into the mix, the iPhone, kids are staying up until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So we have a chronically sleep-deprived group of students. Some of you are probably familiar with the push in some school systems throughout the U.S. and even in Europe, where the start times of schools have been delayed with great success. And I'm not talking like 2 hours. I'm talking 36 minutes to delay the start of first period. Some really interesting research that came out of Washington State, Kentucky, and also Minnesota with delayed start times. Okay, so enough images. Let's get into a couple of the initial thoughts. There are always exceptions. So I'm going to be speaking about teenagers. Some of you might have situations that are particularly different from what I'm talking about when I'm talking about girls or boys, teachers, school counselors, administrators. It's inevitable. I sort of have to speak in general terms. And the word adolescence itself has been around for a number of centuries, but our current understanding of adolescence really was cemented by G. Stanley Hall, a psychologist who lived at the same time as Sigmund Freud. And he said that adolescence started at 12, ended at 18, and referred to it as a period of great storm and stress. And as much as we understand a little bit more about adolescence, I think to some degree we still operate from that standpoint. So I'm just curious, Father Tom, is the chat working where participants will be able to type in some answers, or should I use the Q&A?
Try using the chat and send it. When you send it, just send it to everyone and we'll see if they're able to see it.
Okay, so my question is, when does adolescence start? At what age? And it only is giving me the option for hosts and panelists.
Okay. So
we can use the Q&A.
Yeah, I use the Q&A.
Okay, so my first question to the audience is, when does adolescence start? Give me an age. Type it in to the Q&A box. "13," someone says. Keep going, folks. Going to give you a hint. It's a little bit lower than that. Puberty, 10 to 12. 12. We do have let me go back for a second. We actually do have a winner. I'm bouncing around a little bit here. Donna gets and seeing some issues around 10. Okay, Erica Martinez, interesting. We're going to start with, first and foremost, most psychologists agree that it's about the age of 10. It's been pushed back from the age of 12. Erica Martinez is onto something here. What we're finding is communities that where the families don't have a lot of access to natural and organic foods. We see girls starting puberty at about 7.5. We do still see in other areas puberty beginning at about 12 or so. So that average really is 10. So puberty, so adolescence is starting at the age of 10. Now let's go ahead. Let's do another one. When do you think it ends? So adolescence starts at 10. Let me ask you another one. At what age do you think it ends? Do you think it ends at 18? Do you think it ends at, well, somebody, I did a presentation in Canada. Somebody said it never ends, especially for men. So when do you think it ends? John Waters says 21. Patrice says 19. Teresa says 20. I'm going to give you all a hint. At what age does your car insurance typically begin to decrease in price? And at what age do you no longer pay a fee for renting a car? There we go, 25. So most psychologists are coming to this agreement that adolescence has expanded. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. People are living longer. So our understanding of 12 to 18 is now shifting from about 10 to 25. The reason why they're saying 25 is because when you look at car accident rates in the United States, it starts here at the age of 16, stays there. Once you get to 25, it drops, continues. Once you get back to 80, chances for a car accident do begin to increase. So for the purposes of our understanding, we're going to say that adolescence is between the ages of 10 to 25. All right. Also in our discussion, I think to a large degree, when it comes to behavior, especially within the classroom, I think a lot of us are looking for that one cause. It's got to be this, because then it makes it a lot easier. Folks, I'm a systems person. I really believe that when we're working with an individual, it doesn't matter if it's an adult, a child, or a teenager, that behavior is based on a number of different factors. So that kid at third period might be behaving in a way as a result of what happened in second period. They might be behaving in a way because of their diet, their sleep, what's going on at home, a romantic relationship, the frustration with their academic performance. So there's a number of different factors that are going into it. I think today's generation has unfairly been accused to a large degree of being the most anxious generation, that they don't have any resiliency. And we could spend a lot of time arguing that. We can look at some research studies, self-reported research studies, which indicate that kids today do seem to report higher rates of anxiety and depression. But my curiosity really is, are they reacting to their surroundings? Have we, when I say we, I'm talking about our society, I'm talking about adults. Have we become more anxious? Have parents become more anxious? Have administrators become more anxious? Maybe it's not just the kids, maybe it's all of us. And let me just put this out there to you. There, there is this expression when people feel very, very nervous. They may have been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, or maybe not. People will sometimes say, I have anxiety. And I do this when working with teenagers and even with their parents and families. I will say, do you have anxiety, or are you experiencing anxiety? Just think about the power of our words. When we have anxiety, it's almost as if we're saying, I have this thing and I'm going to carry it with me around, and I'm going to take it from home and I'm going to take it to school. Whereas if we experience anxiety, it's something that sort of flows through us. If you want to build resiliency with kids and teenagers, Really, the research shows that in order to build resiliency, that kid or teenager needs to have only one adult in their life whom they believe cares about them. So I once heard someone say, and I think it was John Maxwell, that people won't care what you have to teach until they know that you care about them. So you might be that one person in a kid's life who has helped them to develop that resiliency. Because the research shows if you look at kids who are in war torn areas, children who struggled through Hurricane Katrina, their chances for resiliency automatically doubled when they reported there was one adult in their life whom they believe cared about them. That could have been a parent, a teacher, a counselor, a coach, a priest, rabbi, minister, whomever, aunt, uncle. So those are some initial thoughts. All right, I'm going to sort of start dating ourselves here to give us a context for kids today. I'm showing you an ad from Radio Shack. I'm sure some of you remember Radio Shack, or maybe The Wiz, or I'm from New York and there was a store called Crazy Eddie. All of these things right here on this advertisement in a newspaper from the 80s are now contained within this simple phone. Times have changed. Kids don't even wear watches anymore. They don't have to. AI has taken things over, but the reality is they experience their sense of current events through this phone. They do not experience things the same way that we do. I'll tell you a funny story. A student of mine was waiting for a phone call from a track coach at University of Michigan. This is going way back. And he took his phone with him and went to the gym, came back. His father asked him if the track coach called, and he said, no, not yet. And he took the phone and he put it in the cradle in the kitchen. The kid had actually taken the home phone with him um, because it wasn't attached to anything. So that student, this is going back, I think like 10, 15 years ago, was actually operating from this is a cordless phone, similar to what the first smartphones or cell phones were like. So the father freaked out, called me and said, like, is there something wrong with my son? I said, absolutely not. I mean, this makes perfect sense to him, given his context. So let's spend a couple of moments thinking about our context and thinking about the generations. So I'm actually going to begin showing some generations within the United States to you. This is the silent generation. I'm sorry, the greatest generation. Our next one is the silent generation. These are the baby boomers, Generation X. And then we have the millennials, Gen Z, and kids up to about the age of 14. In the Q&A box, why don't you begin typing what you think the name for this current generation is? What do we call the kids in middle school and in early high school and elementary school? What's their name? I'll give you a hint. It starts with generation. Gen Alpha, Erica Martinez, boom, you got it. They are known as Gen Alpha. So we went to Gen Z. It's going back to the beginning. The other thing, too, is keep this in the back of your mind. Gen Alpha is going to be one of the most revolutionary generations we've ever experienced. They've been in elementary school in masks. If you look back through these generations, the way in which they impact their society as adults typically is related to something that they experienced in their youth. So if they went to school in masks, there's a very good chance that they are going to revolutionize health and wellness. We're probably going to end up living a lot longer. Well, maybe not us. By the time Gen Alpha gets older, we'll all be gone. By that point, I don't mean to get a little despondent here, but that's the reality. Okay, now I'm going to ask you to do an activity. And on our next slide, this has a QR code. So feel free to use your cell phone, or maybe I can copy and paste this. I'm going to come back to my full screen in just a second. Can I paste it into the Q&A?
If you send it to me, I can put it in the Q&A, I think.
Okay, just sent it to you, Father Tom?
Yep, I got it. And then I think I can copy it and send it to everybody actually I'll try sending it to everybody in the chat. Let's see what happens.
Okay. So folks, you're going to go to a Google form, and I want to try and make this as interactive as possible. So you're not just sitting there and listening to me for, 30 some odd minutes.
If you got the link to the form in the chat, would you just give me a thumbs up? Type something in the Q&A and say, yes, I got it. Please, otherwise I'll try sending it in the Q&A box. If you go down and look at the chat at the bottom, you should see it from me.
Yeah, Father Tom, it looks like you sent it to everyone.
Yeah. I just want to make sure everybody got it.
Okay.
Alice, I'm just going to give you the chance to talk. Can you let me know if you got the chat?
Yes, we
Okay.
we can click on the form. We can't respond in the chat, but we could click on it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great, I'm seeing responses. Now, can you see my screen right now?
Mm-hmm. I can see it.
Not the slideshow, the Google form.
I see the QR code.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up these are people's responses in real time.
Okay, great.
Great, so we've got about 12 responses, so 14. Okay, they're still coming in.
There's 20 people in this session, just so you know, Terry.
Okay, we've got 15 responses. And it looks like Gen Xers are leading the way. Folks, even though I am follically challenged, years ago, I did rock a mullet. So Gen X probably had the best music of any generation. Maybe the 37.5% baby boomers will disagree with me, but all right. So we are now at 16 responses. I'm going to increase my screen, and we're going to spend a little bit of time going through this. Okay, so we have no Gen Zers. All right, so for baby boomers, what existential threat scared you the most during the teen years? It looks like communism wins. For Gen X, what existential threat scared you the most during your teen years? AIDS. For millennials, what existential threat scared you most during teen years? The Y2K problem is at 6.3. I was scared of the sniper. Oh, that's right. I remember that. And the war on terrorism. Okay. And there is one Gen Z or school shootings. Okay. So one of the things that I want to emphasize with this particular exercise here is that for those of us who grew up at a time where there was an existential threat, nothing really seemed to come to fruition. So for boomers, communism, it was very scary. We were on the brink of nuclear war, but that didn't happen. And AIDS during the 80s, for the most part, was limited to a very, very small group. It was homosexual men. And for millennials, the Y2K didn't happen. The sniper did happen in that small area. And the war on terrorism, 9/11 did happen, but it was a little removed. For Gen Z and Alpha, this thing of school shootings is actually quite real. It is happening fairly often. We drill for it. We actually have to drill for it in schools several times a year. And we do different types of drills. We do lockdowns, stay puts, and other types of drills. So that's not to say that this generation has more quote unquote anxiety. What that means, though, are that their existential threats are not just ethereal things that are out there. These are very real experiences that they're seeing day in and day out. So let me go back to my screen share. And let's talk about teenagers again in general, moving away from the generations and all the things that they're going through. So they're going through puberty, all of these hormonal changes, neurological changes. The smartphone has definitely created some angst with them. As a matter of fact, according to the Pew Research Center, before COVID, almost 60% of teenagers self-disclosed that they themselves were worried about their cell phone use. They're disconnecting from their parents. They're supposed to be disconnecting from their parents because they're seeking acceptance within their peer groups. They're experimenting with dating and romantic relationships. And I'll just give you a hint here. It doesn't matter if that brain is 16, 36, or 66. The first 2 months of any new romantic relationship, that brain looks like it's addicted to heroin. That's why, for teenagers in high school or in middle school, if they haven't heard from their boyfriend or girlfriend after texting them or sending them, a reel on Instagram or sending them a snap, they may end up texting them 100 times in 1 hour. They are experimenting, using, and potentially abusing chemical substances. Thing about it, I just want to mention something about THC, marijuana, particularly vaping. Today's marijuana, you can buy a gummy that is 95% pure THC. So during the 70s and 80s, the average marijuana street joint had anywhere from 4 to 7% THC in it. It is a psychoactive chemical substance that is categorized as a mild hallucinogen. For teenagers, there's a definite increase in sensation seeking. So their dopamine levels are very different than ours. Dopamine is that chemical involved in risk. It's also involved in learning. Some really interesting experiments show that, rats even and humans, if you have a bunch of adolescent rats in a box, for every adolescent rat that you add to that box, dopamine levels of the other teenage rats increase. Once you put an adult rat into that box, dopamine levels decrease. It's the same thing for humans. You've experienced it multiple times. You walk into a classroom, there's a couple of kids talking there, and all of a sudden they turn and look at you, and they may get quiet, or they may pretend like you don't even exist, folks, because you're not cool. You don't create higher dopamine levels for them. They get excited being around other teenagers. Research shows that when teenagers even think about taking a risk, their dopamine levels go up. And then most states think at the age of 16, they're safe enough to drive. Here's some sobering statistics. For every teenager that you introduce into a newly licensed teenager's car, the chances for a fatal accident essentially double. They don't have the experience. They're easily distracted with that. And what I want you to do for a moment is take a look at those 8 bullet points. And essentially, this is what you get. Okay, that's you. Those are the teenagers. Those are their parents. Those are the principals. Those are the counselors. So it can be a lot of stress, but the reality is, if you're not having fun with them, and if you don't find teenagers to be fun, you might be in the wrong profession, because they do have some cognitive distortions. They think very differently than we do. David Elkind, a psychologist in the late 60s, challenged Jean Piaget, who was saying that, according to the 4 stages of cognitive development, by the age of 11, the average kid grows out of egocentricity. David Elkind said, no. Because of all the physical, social, emotional, psychological changes that are going on with teenagers in puberty, they're constantly looking at themselves. And as a result of that, they believe that other people are watching them. It's what Elkind called the imaginary audience. And this would make sense if they're watching themselves and they believe other people are watching themselves. They become a little egocentric, and also begin to believe that nobody understands them. Do you ever read teen poetry after a breakup? It's like they're all Shakespearean characters, like nobody could possibly understand the depths of me. Sometimes as teachers and counselors, and even parents, we might make the mistake when a kid is going through something challenging. We may say to them, I know how you feel. I got news for you. No one on this webinar has any idea of what it's like to be a teenager today. All of us have an idea of what it's like to be a teenager, but nobody has an idea of what it's like to be a teenager today. So if they are struggling, what I invite you to do is, rather than saying, I know what you going through, or, how are you dealing with that, or what's that like? Don't ask questions. Give them directives. Something like, well, tell me more about that. I'm really interested. Because they'll begin to talk, but you got to be careful of your facial expressions. So Deborah Yergel and Todd of Harvard University did a really interesting experiment with her associate Stacy Gruber. She took a group of teenagers and adults and put them into an fMRI machine and wanted to see how they responded to facial expressions. So she showed all the participants 6 basic human emotions: fear, anger, sadness, joy, disgust, and shock. Take a good look at those faces. What I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to show you the next slide, and in the Q&A, you're just going to type in what emotion you think this actor is relaying. Here's the picture. Is that joy? Is that shock? Is that sadness? Is that anger, disgust, or fear? What do you think it is? Go ahead and type away. Okay, I see fear, shock, fear, disgust, shock with judgment, fear, shock. Okay. So would you be surprised to know that this actor was told to show the face of fear? So let's go back for a second and take a look. Fear, raised eyebrows, and teeth. Here she is, teeth, raised eyebrows. Yergel and Todd, in her experiment, found that 50% of the teenagers said that this face was showing anger. Anger. So that should give us some insight. Do you ever have that experience where a student in your class suddenly changes? Maybe they didn't turn in a homework assignment and you're disappointed. Maybe they were talking to someone else. Maybe they were being distracted and you simply looked at them. From my end as a counselor, they will come into my office and say, you know, Father Tom hates me. And I will say something like, what sort of cognitive behavioral evidence do you have for that? And they'll say, well, it's the way Father Tom looks at me. And they say it so convincingly. They're convinced that you don't like them because of the way that you look at them. Well, Jurgel and Todd's experiment shows this. This is what happens. Now, the other thing that happened was that Jurgel and Todd saw that the teenagers were using an entirely different part of their brain. They were using their limbic system to interpret a facial expression, whereas the adults were using their prefrontal cortex. So what I'm going to ask you all to do, just put your two hands up like this for a second. Okay, make fists. Bring them together. Take a look at those two fists together. That's about the size of your brain. Now, when I'm working with a group of 15-year-olds, usually the boys in the back of the classroom do this or that because they don't believe that this really is about the average size of the brain. It's a nice model of the brain, so to speak. It's probably a little bit bigger. The bottom of your palms, where the bottom of that brain is, that's sort of like the limbic system. Where your pinkies are, that's sort of like the prefrontal cortex. This is typically the last part of the brain to fully develop neural connections and also the neural connections from the prefrontal cortex to the limbic system. Here's your right hemisphere, here's your left hemisphere. The only basic biological difference between males and females, the XX and the XY, is that females have 30% more corpus callosum than males. So these are the fibers that connect the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere. Maybe it speaks towards the capacity for females to communicate better. The right hemisphere communicates more with the left hemisphere. That was decided in the womb. So there are a lot of neuromyths out there. You may have heard that there are right brain people or left brain people. There's no empirical evidence to support that, folks. We use both hemispheres of our brain. You may have heard that we only use 10% of our brain. We actually use all of our brain, but typically not at one time. And also the brain seems to be the most active during sleep, especially when we are dreaming. That REM state. And the other neuromyth is that you can sort of take a online survey and identify whether or not you're a kinesthetic learner, a visual learner, or an auditory learner. There is not one single study that empirically proves that. If you can see, you are a visual learner. If you can hear, you're an auditory learner. If you've got sense receptors, you're a kinesthetic learner. We all learn in those ways. We don't necessarily have one preferred style. We oftentimes think that we're visual learners because what person, especially a teenager, when they open up a book, doesn't want to see pictures because that means that they have to read less text. What we miss with these learning styles is the fact that all of us retain information on an emotional level. We process information on an emotional level. You don't believe me? Just close your eyes and recite the ABCs. Guaranteed you just sang it. Your most powerful experiences with teachers were on an emotional level. Those teachers that you believed cared about you, or those classes where you had a lot of fun. This is one of the things that we need to do with our students, is to connect with them on an emotional level. You don't necessarily need to be a comedian with them, but you need to let them know that you're interested. You need to let them know that you care. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes it might be more important for a teacher to let the students know that the content of a student's life is more important than the content of their lesson plan. That might be a more impactful intervention. It can be hard, especially in this high stakes testing environment, to do that. But a simple intervention could simply be to stand outside of your classroom and greet students with fist bumps. There's research that indicates that students are more invested in a class when you have a teacher who greets them at the door. So it's called PGAD, positive greeting at the door. Just do that. And remember those facial expressions? You want to look happy to see them. You don't necessarily have to feel happy. You can be stressed out, but you want to be able to give that sort of image of, I'm here, I'm available, I'm open. You can set boundaries with them and say, not right now. I've got 3 minutes between class. Maybe we can talk after class. So I want to go into a little bit of detail with this limbic system really quickly. There are 3 parts to it. The amygdala, which is the emotional part of the brain. Folks, teenagers experience emotions 3 times greater than we do. At the age of 14, teens go through a 2 million plus explosion of neurons in their amygdala. So there are a lot of highs and lows. When they are reacting, many times they're not necessarily reacting to you. It's just they're on that emotional roller coaster. That hippocampus is responsible for memory. Look how close these two are, the amygdala and the hippocampus. They're right there. The emotional memory, that's what you want. And that hypothalamus is essentially what releases hormones. Where we want students a lot of times in our classroom is we also want them to be able to be using their prefrontal cortex. But Judy Willis, a neurologist, actually identified that this limbic system is the gatekeeper to the prefrontal cortex. In other words, if kids don't feel safe, the information is not going to come up into the CEO of the brain, this part of the brain that's responsible for executive functioning, where they engage in planning, time management, organization, short-term memory, their ability to sort of recall things, their ability to reflect on their own thinking, their own behavior, known as metacognition, to regulate their emotions, to sort of get that essay started, and to be flexible about things. Teenagers, to a large degree in their thinking, are very black and white. They need some help with that gray, because remember, those neurons are forming. Okay. And to give you an image of these forming neurons, I just want to put out to you this image of the United States. Think about the interstate system. Remember, Eisenhower designed this because when he was young, he went to Germany and saw the Autobahn. When he was a young lieutenant colonel in the Army Corps of Engineer, he went from DC to California. It took him 56 days to get from coast to coast. They did stops along the way. Along the Lincoln Highway, there was one paved road. And actually, in parts of the Midwest, it wasn't even paved. So they had to do a lot of side roads. We as adults have interstates. For me, I live by 95. And I can get from point A to point B relatively quickly, but I don't have a lot of side routes. Teenagers enjoy music a lot more than we do. Teenagers experience highs and lows greater than we do. Teenagers typically retain more information than we do. Their brains are like sponges. It's easier as a teenager to learn a second, third, fourth, fifth language. It's easier to learn a musical instrument because of all these neural pathways. But folks, we sometimes have to lay the asphalt for them. We then have to do it with them and show them and take a step back and let them sometimes make mistakes. There is value in an F. There is value in a 0. They need to trip things up. And I also know of plenty of teachers who actually allow them to do test corrections, to make mistakes, because that's how those neurons form. is through trial and error. And a lot of times we might struggle with parents because parents are the ones who may not necessarily want them to fail. So we might need to emphasize to the parent that it's important for them to have this experience, that at the end of the day, this one test, or maybe this quarter grade, is not necessarily going to impact their overall high school GPA the way in which they think they do. So sometimes we might be coming down not just the student, but also the parent. I'm coming to the end of our presentation, so I just want to emphasize a couple of things. Folks, what I've tried to do is to give you a little bit of insight into teenagers. And I think them coming from those younger years into those teen years, we might be afraid of losing them to risk-taking behaviors. We might be afraid of losing them to drugs and alcohol. We might be afraid of losing them to gangs. But what I hope that I was able to do is to show you some ways to get them, because when you get them, you've got them. And when they feel like you get them, they will talk with you more. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to just take a moment, and this will give you an opportunity to give some feedback, answer some questions with regards to the session. So we'll reinforce some things. What I've tried to do during this webinar is also insert a couple of different activities every 15 minutes or so. We're not in person, so if I were doing this in person with you, I would actually stop talking and have you talk with each other. Because of the webinar, we use the Q&A thing. I used a Google form so that you can see how other people think. This is how you want your classrooms to operate. I know that many of you probably do this already, but you want them to be engaged, you want them to be moving, you want them to be talking with one another, because the more that they do that, the more that they will form neurons. Neurons that fire together, wire together. So you want them to be getting up and moving around the classroom to go into groups. All right, Father Tom, do we have any time for a Q&A?
Sure. Yep, we do. If anybody wants to ask any questions, I'm going to stop the recording, but go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to those.